The polished oak door of courtroom 7B loomed before me like the gates of destiny. My fingers trembled as I smoothed down my navy blazer, the one I'd bought back when I still had access to our joint account, before Jack had frozen everything. Inside my briefcase lay a single manila envelope, its contents worth more than all the designer suits he was probably wearing today. "Ready, Mrs. Anderson?" My lawyer, Rachel Winters, touched my arm gently. Her confidence had been my lifeline these past months. But even she didn't know what I was about to reveal. "It's back to Miss Patterson soon," I reminded her, attempting a smile. "And yes, I'm ready." The security guard pushed open the heavy door, and the familiar scent of lemon polish and anxiety washed over me. Jack was already seated at the defendant's table, his silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed, his Italian leather briefcase probably worth more than my monthly rental. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I caught that familiar smirk, the one that said he thought he had everything figured out. If only he knew. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Martinez." I stood, smoothing my skirt, watching as the judge took her place at the bench. Her dark eyes scanned the courtroom with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many bitter endings. "Be seated," she commanded. "Anderson versus Anderson, final hearing regarding asset division." She glanced at her papers. "I understand there's been some new evidence presented?" Rachel stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client has documentation that significantly impacts the distribution of marital assets." Across the aisle, Jack's attorney, Howard Sterling, downtown Chicago's most expensive divorce lawyer, straightened his tie. "Your Honor, we weren't notified of any new evidence. This is highly irregular. The documentation was only recently discovered, Your Honor," Rachel countered. "And it's directly relevant to Mr. Anderson's financial declarations." I watched Jack's jaw tighten. After 23 years of marriage, I knew every micro-expression, every tell. He was worried, but trying not to show it. My mind drifted back to that rainy Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when I'd been clearing out the last of my things from our Lake Forest home. The movers had already taken the furniture I was allowed to claim, leaving me to pack the personal items Jack's lawyers had generously permitted me to keep. In the master bedroom closet behind a loose panel I'd always meant to fix, I found the first breadcrumb. A single receipt yellowed with age, but readable enough to send me down a rabbit hole that would change everything. "Miss Patterson," Judge Martinez's voice pulled me back to the present. "Your attorney indicates you have personal testimony to offer regarding these documents." "Yes, Your Honor." My voice came out steadier than I expected. Jack leaned forward, whispering something to Howard. I recognized his expression, the same one he wore when closing major deals at his firm. He thought he could control this, just like he'd controlled everything else in our marriage. Rachel handed me a glass of water as I approached the witness stand. The courtroom lights felt harsh, unforgiving, perfect for what I was about to do. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk instructed. "Catherine Marie Patterson Anderson." "Mrs. Anderson," Rachel began, but I interrupted gently. "Miss Patterson, please. I've decided to reclaim my maiden name." I saw Jack's lip curl slightly. He'd always hated my independence, though he'd hidden it well during our early years. Back when I was still teaching at Northwestern, before he'd convinced me that being a corporate wife was a full-time job. "Miss Patterson," Rachel corrected herself. "Could you tell the court about your discovery of these documents?" I took a deep breath. The manila envelope sat on the table before Rachel, innocent-looking but lethal as a landmine. 3 weeks ago, while collecting my personal belongings, I found something unusual in our former bedroom, I began, meeting Jack's gaze. A receipt tucked behind a loose panel in the closet. It was for a safe deposit box at First Midwest Bank, opened in 2002. Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly. "And this safe deposit box was not listed in Mr. Anderson's financial disclosures?" "No, Your Honor." I watched Jack's confident expression waver slightly. "In fact, when I visited First Midwest, I discovered it wasn't the only one. There were 3 boxes, all opened within months of each other, all under different corporate entities." Howard Sterling stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. My client's business dealings are relevant," Rachel interrupted, "when they involve hiding marital assets. We have documentation proving these entities were created solely to conceal funds from Miss Patterson." The overhead lights hummed as Howard shuffled through his papers. Jack's leg was bouncing under the table, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since our first year of marriage, when he was still a junior partner trying to make his mark. "The entities in question," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "were established using variations of a very specific date, the 15th of March, 1999, the day our son Michael was born." I paused, letting that sink in. Jack had always claimed that day changed his life, made him realize he needed to build a legacy. What he'd never admitted was how he planned to keep that legacy all to himself. Each company name contained some version of those numbers. MDC negative 15,399 holdings. March 15th Enterprises. 31,599 Capital Group. Judge Martinez's pen scratched against her notepad. And you can establish these companies were funded with marital assets? Yes, Your Honor. I pulled out a sheet of paper from the documents Rachel had prepared. Each company was initially funded with transfers from our joint accounts. The timing coincided perfectly with major bonuses Jack received from his firm. Bonuses that were considered marital property. Jack's face had lost its smug expression. His eyes darted to Howard, who was frantically flipping through his files. Over the course of 15 years, I continued, these companies received regular deposits totaling more than $12 million. Money that was never declared during our divorce proceedings. The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on her keyboard. I could feel the weight of Judge Martinez's gaze as she processed this information. That's a serious allegation, Miss Patterson, she said carefully. Do you have proof of these transfers? Rachel stepped forward, lifting the manila envelope. We do, Your Honor. When Miss Patterson discovered the safe deposit boxes, she also found documentation of every transfer. Mr. Anderson kept meticulous records. I watched as Jack's hand clenched into a fist. His pride in his own cleverness had always been his weakness. He documented everything, believing his hiding places were too clever to be found. Furthermore, Rachel continued, we have evidence that Mr. Anderson planned this deception years in advance. The lease agreements for the safe deposit boxes were signed using a power of attorney Miss Patterson had granted him while she was hospitalized during her pregnancy. The memory of that difficult time, laid up with preeclampsia, trusting Jack to handle everything, sent a wave of anger through me. He'd used my vulnerability, my trust in him, to set up his betrayal. Your Honor, Howard interjected, standing again. These are complex business transactions being taken out of context. My client has always maintained separate business interests, which were fully disclosed. Judge Martinez finished for him. Yes, Mr. Sterling, I'm aware. However, if these allegations are true, she turned her attention back to me. Miss Patterson, please continue. I squared my shoulders. The documentation shows a clear pattern. Every time we hit a milestone, buying our house, Michael's private school tuition, my mother's medical bills, Jack would suggest pulling money from our joint accounts for investments. The money would disappear into these shell companies, then resurface in the safe deposit boxes as cash and bearer bonds. Jack's face had turned ashen. His own records were damning him piece by piece. But it wasn't just about hiding money, I said, my voice growing softer. It was about control, about making sure I'd be dependent on him even after a divorce. I pulled out another document, a letter I'd found along with the financial records. This is a draft of an email Jack wrote to his financial advisor in 2018. In it, he discusses his exit strategy from our marriage. He specifically mentions wanting to ensure I'd be left with, and I quote, just enough to avoid public embarrassment, but not enough for true independence. The gallery behind me erupted in murmurs. Judge Martinez tapped her gavel once, restoring order. Jack was staring straight ahead now, his face a mask of stone, but I could see the pulse hammering in his throat. Your Honor, Howard tried again, these documents would need to be authenticated. They already have been, Rachel interrupted smoothly. We've had forensic accountants verify every transaction. The documentation includes bank records, transfer receipts, and Mr. Anderson's own handwritten notes. Additionally, we've subpoenaed records from First Midwest Bank confirming the existence and access history of the safe deposit boxes. I watched as Jack finally turned to whisper urgently to Howard. The confidence that had radiated from him just an hour ago had evaporated. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. But perhaps most telling, I continued, pulling out one final document, is this letter from last month. It's a directive to his bank manager, instructing them to transfer the remaining contents of the safe deposit boxes to a bank in the Cayman Islands. Judge Martinez's eyebrows rose sharply. After divorce proceedings had already begun? Yes, Your Honor. The letter is dated 3 days after I was served with divorce papers. The implications hung heavy in the air. Attempting to hide assets after filing for divorce wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Jack knew it too. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped slightly. The timing of this transfer attempt, Rachel added, coincides perfectly with Mr. Anderson's initial settlement offer to my client, an offer that would have left her with barely enough to cover a year's living expenses, despite their 23 years of marriage and her contributions to his career. Howard Sterling was now frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to find some way to minimize the damage. Miss Patterson, Judge Martinez said, studying me over her reading glasses, you mentioned your contributions to Mr. Anderson's career. Could you elaborate? I nodded, gathering my thoughts. When we first married, I was an associate professor of economics at Northwestern. Jack was just starting at his firm. I used my connections to introduce him to several clients who became instrumental in his rise to partner. I also took over managing our household entirely, freeing him to work the long hours his career demanded. At his request, I continued, I gave up my tenure-track position to focus on supporting his networking efforts. I planned every dinner party, every charity gala, every weekend retreat that helped him build his client base. I essentially became his unpaid social director and PR manager. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew every word was true. We also agreed that I would be the primary caregiver for our son, especially after Michael was diagnosed with dyslexia. Jack's schedule didn't allow him to attend the endless rounds of testing and tutoring sessions. I became Michael's advocate, researcher, and support system, while maintaining the social calendar Jack's position required. I paused, remembering those exhausting years. I didn't mind then. We were partners, building a life together. Or so I thought. Rachel stepped forward with another document. Your Honor, we've prepared a detailed accounting of Miss Patterson's contributions to the marriage, both financial and non-financial. This includes the current market value of her sacrificed career earnings, based on the trajectory of her academic peers who remained in their positions. Jack was now staring at his hands, avoiding everyone's eyes. Your Honor, Howard finally stood again, his voice less confident now. While these allegations are concerning, we would request time to review and respond to this new evidence. The time for disclosure was during the initial proceedings, Mr. Sterling. Judge Martinez cut in sharply. Your client was required to provide a full accounting of all assets. Instead, it appears he deliberately concealed substantial marital property while simultaneously attempting to deny Miss Patterson her rightful share. I watched as Jack loosened his tie slightly. The courtroom suddenly felt very warm, despite the usual chill of the air conditioning. Furthermore, the judge continued, any attempt to transfer assets out of the country after initiating divorce proceedings represents a serious breach of good faith negotiations. Howard glanced at Jack, who had gone completely still. Miss Patterson, Judge Martinez turned back to me. What are you seeking in light of these revelations? I sat up straighter. This was the moment I'd rehearsed countless times. Your Honor, I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice and fairness. I request that all hidden assets be declared marital property and divided equitably. Additionally, I ask that the court consider Mr. Anderson's attempts at deception when determining the final distribution. I also request, I continued, my voice steady, that the court consider awarding additional punitive damages to compensate for the legal expenses I've incurred uncovering these hidden assets, as well as the emotional distress caused by this betrayal. Jack's head snapped up at this, his face flushing. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Additionally, Your Honor, Rachel interjected, given Mr. Anderson's demonstrated willingness to conceal assets, we request an immediate freeze on all accounts linked to the shell companies and any related entities, pending full forensic accounting. Judge Martinez nodded slowly, her expression grave. Mr. Sterling, does your client wish to make a statement regarding these allegations? Howard leaned over to whisper urgently to Jack, who seemed to have aged years in the past hour. After a tense moment, Jack shook his head slightly. No statement at this time, Your Honor, Howard replied, his voice strained. However, we request a brief recess to confer with our client. Granted, Judge Martinez said. We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. And Mr. Anderson? She fixed him with a stern look. I strongly suggest you consider your position carefully during this break. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in hushed conversations. Rachel touched my arm gently. You did beautifully, she whispered. Want to get some air? I shook my head, watching Jack hurry out with Howard. His legs really had looked unsteady as he stood, exactly as I'd imagined when I first discovered those documents. I'll stay here, I said quietly. I've spent enough time running away from uncomfortable situations. Through the courtroom windows, I could see the Chicago skyline stretching toward a crystal blue October sky. The same view I'd had from my office at Northwestern, before I'd given it all up for the man who just tried to leave me destitute. A strange sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. When court reconvened, Jack looked like a different man. Gone was the polished corporate warrior who'd strode in hours earlier. In his place sat someone I barely recognized. Shoulders slumped, hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it too many times. Howard stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, after consulting with my client, we wish to propose an immediate settlement conference. Mr. Anderson is prepared to make significant concessions regarding the division of all assets, both disclosed and previously undisclosed. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. Miss Winters, your thoughts? Rachel glanced at me, and I gave her a slight nod. We're willing to negotiate, Your Honor, provided full disclosure is made regarding all hidden assets, and Mr. Anderson agrees to criminal immunity in exchange for complete cooperation. Jack's head snapped up at the word criminal. Our eyes met across the courtroom. Very well, Judge Martinez said. We'll move to my chambers. Miss Patterson, Mr. Anderson, both attorneys, please. As we filed into the judge's chambers, I caught a glimpse of our reflections in the window. Jack and me, separated by our lawyers, the city sprawling behind us. How many times had we posed for photos like this at charity events, playing the perfect power couple? The judge's chambers were warmer than the courtroom, filled with law books and family photos. As we took our seats around a polished conference table, I noticed Jack's hands trembling slightly as he reached for the water pitcher. Before we begin, Judge Martinez said, I want to be clear about something. Mr. Anderson, your actions have seriously undermined the integrity of these proceedings. However, the judge continued, Miss Patterson's willingness to negotiate shows remarkable grace. I strongly suggest you demonstrate equal good faith in these discussions. Jack nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I understand, Your Honor. Over the next hour, numbers flew back and forth across the table. The hidden millions, the house in Lake Forest, the vacation property in Wisconsin, the art collection we'd spent years building. With each revelation, Jack seemed to shrink further into himself. Rachel expertly steered the negotiations, ensuring every asset was accounted for. When Howard tried to argue for keeping certain business interests separate, she simply held up the damning documentation we'd found. Eventually, he stopped trying. Through it all, I remained calm, speaking only when necessary. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. By late afternoon, we had reached an agreement. The final numbers made my head spin, far more than I'd initially thought we were worth. Jack's hidden accounts had been extensive. One more thing, I said, as Howard began gathering the draft settlement papers. Everyone looked up, surprised. I'd been quiet for the last hour. I want a letter, I said, looking directly at Jack. A letter to Michael explaining everything. He deserves to know why his college fund was suddenly unavailable last semester, why he had to take out loans while you were hiding millions. For the first time that day, real shame crossed Jack's face. Our son's struggle to pay for his junior year had been the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. You can review it with your lawyer, I added, but he needs to hear the truth from you. Jack nodded slowly. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me since the hearing began. I'll write it tonight. Judge Martinez watched this exchange with approval. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to finalize everything. I expect all paperwork to be in order, including a detailed accounting of every hidden asset. She fixed Jack with a stern look. Every asset, Mr. Anderson. My patience with surprises has reached its limit. As we prepared to leave, Jack paused by the door. Catherine, he said softly, I held up my hand. Save it for the letter, Jack. Michael's the one who needs to hear it. The sun was setting as Rachel and I walked out of the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. You know, Rachel said as we waited for our cars, in 15 years of practice, I've never seen someone handle themselves with such dignity in that situation. I smiled, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on. I had a good teacher, I replied, thinking of my mother. She'd always said grace under pressure was the truest form of strength. What will you do now? Rachel asked. The question caught me off guard, though I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks. With the settlement we'd reached, my options were suddenly endless. I think, I said slowly, I'm going to call Northwestern, see if they need any adjunct professors in economics. I felt a smile spreading across my face. It's time I got back to being Catherine Patterson. That night, in my small rented apartment, I sat at the window looking out at the city. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, Dad just called. Said he needs to tell me something important. You okay?" I typed back, "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. For the first time in a long time, everything's exactly as it should be." Setting down my phone, I pulled out a small notebook. The same one where I'd first started documenting my discoveries 3 weeks ago. On the last page, I wrote a single sentence. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make your ex-husband's legs go weak." Then I closed the notebook, poured myself a glass of wine, and began planning my next chapter.